Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
It's a great pleasure and privilege to have a chance to talk to Peter Mathias. I hope I can call you Peter.
Do please.
Peter,
I will reciprocate.
Good. Peter, when and where were you born?
I was born in Freshford Cottage Hospital on the 10th of January 1928. My father was in the Navy, and I did not see him until I was over 2 years old. My mother had gone back to live with her parents for the birth, although she'd been close to her parents before then, and that was conditional upon my father's movements in a warship. He was a petty officer then, as a petty officer writer, that is to say he kept the books on the warship, and he was on a goodwill visit down the east coast of the United States on a cruiser HMS Cape Town, and he returned in 1930, and then my mother went to live in a rented flat in Plymouth, close to Devonport, which was where his base was. He was retired from the Navy at the age of 40, I think, in 1932, which was a compulsory exit point for non-commissioned ranks. And it was the worst year, of course, of the slump in 1932. And and Plymouth then was a very small town. And he failed to get a job in Plymouth to his liking, a clerical job, and the closest that he could find employment was in Bristol, and he became a clerk in the Bristol and West Building Society, and they rented a house and then bought a house through the Bristol and West Building Society over many years, and I went therefore to school in Bishop Road Elementary School, as it then was, rather than primary school. And that gave me a slight Bristol accent, I think, or possibly a
West Country accent.
Possibly a Wiltshire accent, I'm not quite sure. But then you didn't leave the Navy, you were transferred to the Naval Reserve if you've been a member of the permanent Navy, the Royal Navy, and therefore he was called up again at Munich, and 1938, and I had just won a scholarship from Bishop Road to Colston's Hospital, as it was then called, which was a local charity school. At that time, a direct grant grammar school, essentially, and therefore, and that was without any charge to my parents, and that made a big difference to them. So that's why I chose Colston's as distinct from the grammar school and Cottam and other schools which were part of the scholarship scheme then. But it meant that I went off to school in 1938 when my father left, and my mother didn't want to live alone, so she went back to live with her parents again for the duration of the war until back 1946, and I spent the holidays.
This was a boarding school, was it?
It was indeed, yes. It was a merchant venturer funded or supported boarding school. What can I...
Tell me something about your mother.
Yes.
As a person.
I mean, it was very surprising that my mother and father ever met, because my mother um, was the sixth child, I think it was, out of a family of 9, living in a small village, Wingfield. I'm much involved in this just at the minute because I'm arranging to have a memorial plaque for my mother and father put into the churchyard at Wingfield. She was a daughter of a long-standing family living in Wingfield for at least 4 generations, called Love, and they lived appropriately in Love's Lane, as it's still called, and they were all servants in the local gentry house, Wingfield House, which was at that time owned by the Kayard family, and my grandfather ran the stables in the Wingfield House, and my grandfather was as a boy he was in the kitchens, and then subsequently, when the head of the family then became a county court judge on a circuit, my grandfather became a court usher. That is to say, he was a personal servant, really, of the judge, and arranged all the practical matters when the judge was on circuit.
You're talking about 2 different grandfathers, because you mentioned one who was in charge of the stables.
That is my great-grandfather.
Yeah.
Daniel Love, and my grandfather
Was the usher.
T.W. Love, Tom Love, who was a pillar of the village in all kinds of ways. And he brought up 9 children, 3 of whom they all reached maturity but did not live as adults all that long. There were two of the boys died and 1 girl, all of TB, and it was thought to be probably milk-borne tuberculosis in those days. But it meant that Wingfield and the Love family were I identified with them very much more than my father's family for a particular reason. My father was born and brought up before he had his own say in the matter, as a dedicated Catholic, of Irish Catholic descent, and my father's mother kept a boarding house for seamen just opposite the Royal Marine Barracks in Plymouth. But he was, I think, never within the faith in any dedicated sense. But he met my mother when there was a Navy Day in Weymouth Bay, and the family went off to Weymouth, as they did very regularly, and they coincided on a Navy Day, and my mother met my father when he was showing her around his warship, and they kept in touch. And as far as his religion was concerned, my father was really absorbed into my mother's family.
So your mother's religion was?
They were traditional rural village Anglicans, essentially, and always had been. My grandfather was, needless to say, as a long-standing resident of not just himself a resident, but of a family of 3 or 4 generations. He was the people's warden. He was church warden, as well as many other things in the village, and my father was really absorbed into that. Although he was fascinated by yoga, and I think also, of course, he travelled very extensively, and had interests in in Eastern religions, but not of any deeply structured kind. But
did either of them usually come to religion at some point in our discussions? Did either of their religions or any religion have a serious effect on your life?
Not I think consciously, although the main decision on Sundays was whether the weather was good enough to be able, and the fields were good enough to be able to go to church for the 11 o'clock service over the fields, or whether we had to walk around the road. That my mother was very faithful within the Anglican faith, and all the family really were, and they had their own burial plot in the churchyard and so on. They were very much identified with the village and identified with the church in the village and so on.
What happened with your own beliefs? I mean, did you remain an Anglican? Are you an Anglican, or?
I went to Colston's, as I said, and that was a very old style English school. I hesitate to use an adjective for it. It was in part it aped the public school tradition, but it was, as far as the religious identification, that was quite certainly specific to the Anglican Church, and one marched across Stapleton Road to the Stapleton Parish Church every morning. I don't mean every morning, I mean every Sunday morning, and up to the fifth form they wore stiff Eton collars outside, and there was a chapel every morning. There were prayers every evening, so it was specifically identified, and it had a compulsory core and all that. So in some ways it had all the disadvantages of the English public school tradition and very few of the advantages. But I was never able to tell to what extent the inadequacies of the school were based upon wartime emergencies, or whether it was just long-standing tradition, because it was a very poor school, poor in financial terms, and poor in other ways too. And all that was compounded by the war, when most of the able-bodied people went off to the war one way or another, and the school picked up the pieces. And on the whole, the school was a very good teaching organisation up to matriculation, but after matriculation it was not a serious educational establishment, and more particularly in wartime, when all these weaknesses were compounded. And when I passed my matriculation, or O-levels as we would now call it, there was no one teaching history at all in the sixth form, and I had to go for 1 hour a week down to the grammar school for a sort of tutorial.
Were you already interested in history as a...
Yes, I was. But on the other hand, as far as my results were concerned, there was nothing to choose between the science side of the sixth form or the art side of the sixth form. But I was interested in history, and therefore took that option.
Do you remember any teachers who were a little bit unusual in encouraging you at any stage, or?
I spent an inordinate amount of time in the sixth form because there was really nothing else to do until one was called up at the age of 18.
Mm.
And I had taken a scholarship here, or tried to take a scholarship here in 1945, when I was already elderly for the sixth form, having gone to the school in 1938 at the age of 11. At the age of 10, I suppose, or 10 and a bit anyway, 10 and a half, because my birthday was in January. And I therefore stayed on at school until I was in the third year of the sixth form. But in 1945, in December, I came up to take a scholarship here, which I failed to get.
This was at King's. King's, yes.
And but then that was in December 1945, and there were then scholarship exams held also at Easter. And I was advised by Christopher Morris, who was one of those interviewing me in December here in King's, that it would be a better bet if I tried for Jesus. He said, I think Jesus would suit you. So I tried again for the Easter examinations, scholarship examinations, and hooked an exhibition at that point, and therefore stayed on until I was called up, essentially, in the summer of 1946, having secured a place here. And Jesus, as was very common then, I think, in that generation, demanded that all those who were coming up from school should have their military service behind them when they arrived. So that is what happened. I spent 2 years in the army as a conscript before coming up in October 1946. My father was called up, as I say, and therefore he was away from 1938 until 1946. And when he was demobilised, he returned to the Bristol and West Building Society. Meanwhile, he had become a warrant writer, a warrant officer writer, and but he was too old for sea service in the Second War, and therefore he was at various shore stations, known in the Navy as stone frigates, and my mother and I would spend part of each holiday following him around the country. He was called back up to in '38 to Macfarlane, but in Devonport that is, but then went to one of the greatest naval bases of the Second World War, which was very appropriately named HMS Lucifer in Swansea, which came under the authority of an even greater naval base, which was Rear Admiral Cardiff, and their remit was to sweep the Bristol Channel of magnetic mines. But he then went from there to Liverpool, when the Western Approaches Command was set up in 1942, and was there for the rest of the war, until after the defeat of Germany. He spent a few months over the winter of 1945-46 in Germany, in Kiel and Hamburg in particular, but going elsewhere, trying to pick up all the documentation of the Battle of the Atlantic campaign from the U-boat side, and all that documentation was returned to the Admiralty in the UK for see if it was of future use, and is now in the National Archives here. Yeah. But and that was a disaster. I mean, it was a terrible winter to be travelling around Europe, and he caught tuberculosis while while there, and was never the same man again. He died in 1960, 61. But so, that was...
Where were you a conscript? You said you were a conscript for 2 years. Where did you...
I was...
within England, was this?
It was indeed in England. After preliminary training, I had opted to join the intelligence corps, as a lot of people in that entry had done, and we did all the initial I Corps training, and then in 1947 the Control Commission took over in Germany from the military establishment, and there were 400 or 500 intelligence corps officers, not NCOs and officers, that were suddenly without a job in Germany, and all flooded back to Aldershot. And those of us who were in training were told to get out, and were offered the option of the softest option was to transfer to the Royal Army Educational Corps, where you were guaranteed 3 stripes or more, and almost the potential offer anyway of the commission if you were willing to sign on for another 5 years, which I was not. So I spent the last period of my military service in the RAE, C, in different places, but in England. I was about to go to Germany, and was sent to Drummond Castle on Loch Lomond, which was an I Corps depot being prepared for, where people were prepared for overseas service. I had all the inoculations, and then that was in September 1948, and my release came through just in time to come to Cambridge for the October term.
While you were at school, were you, apart from the academic work, were there other things that you were particularly interested in?
Oh, everything. It was a small school, and you became an outrageously large fish in a tremendously small pond.
So games, were you?
Oh, everything. I was head prefect. I was the, whatever it was called, the head of the undergraduate. I mean the junior head of the corps. I was, captain of rugby and cricket and all that. It was a very small school in that way.
And music? Were you interested in music or drama?
No. That's been the biggest absence or lacuna all the way through, really. I mean, I laboured as a small child before going off to boarding school at the age of 10 in 1938. I laboured at the behest of my mother with piano lessons, and that was a symbol of escaping from a working class background and to becoming sort of petit bourgeois clerical horizons. But when I got to Colston's, there was really nothing, as I say, because of the war and all that. There was really no continuity, so I without any great regrets at that time, I ceased to play an instrument. That's a pity. I mean, in retrospect.
Do you like listening to music?
Sorry?
Do you listen to a lot of music?
Yes, quite a lot. Quite a lot. And we go to West Road very regularly, and more particularly now we have a minute base in Norfolk. Every parish church in north coast of Norfolk has a music festival in the summer, and we are regular attenders at the Burnham Market Festival, where we were last Saturday, in fact, at one of the concerts there.
Are there any composers who you particularly like? Has it changed over your life, I imagine?
Well, I've always been very fond of the Baroque composers, Scarlatti in particular, I suppose, and so we listen to those, to that genre of music quite a lot. But it's never been a prominent commitment.
Do you write to? Do you have to be in complete silence to write, or do you like music or other sounds when you're writing?
I don't demand background of any kind, so on the whole I prefer silence. And we are not very well equipped, put it that way, for listening to music. I mean, I don't have the means immediately to hand anyway to play music when I'm working at the desk. I also have a stop on my technical evolution, in the sense that although I've tried and tried, there is something that happens between there and my right hand, which is there's no substitute for it, and I find it very difficult to compose when typing or on a tape. So I have to write it all out longhand, scratch it about, and make a terrible mess. But that's the only way in which it seems to work out in any reasonably cultivated English, put it that way.
Once you've written it all out longhand, do you then type it, or does someone else type it? Or
I then forget it and someone else types it. But as I say, my technical evolution stopped in the early 50s, I suppose. And the other thing was that I had that deadly asset, which was a secretary.
So we got you to Jesus College now, in about 1948, was it?
It was indeed in 1948, yeah.
Who were your teachers in Jesus then? Or in Cambridge?
History.
Yes, or in Cambridge in general. Who inspired you most?
Oh, in Jesus, my main mentor, I suppose, was Charles Wilson, because I identified with him and his work as an economic historian, and by that time I was really committed to economic history within the syllabus, more particularly, and Charles Wilson in Jesus was the person whom, in that sense, I identified with, and Vivian Fisher was my tutor, who was also a medieval historian, and was a tutor in the Cambridge sense too, and they. Vivian Fisher was. Did you know him at all?
No.
He was formidable character. He had one boss eye, and he could fix you with his boss eye, and it was a highly intimidating affair. He was not too intimidating initially because I had been very interested in rowing. There was no rowing in Colston's at all, but my father knew about rowing, and we used to row quite a lot when on holiday. And I came up eager to join the boat club in Jesus. This was in 1948, when Jesus won the Grand at Henley, and I duly joined the boat club and met Vivian Fisher for the first time as my tutor a couple of days later. And he said, "What are we doing?" I said, "I joined the boat club." He said, "You resign immediately." He said, no exhibitioner and scholar of Jesus can join the boat club. It's a total commitment," he was. And I was young and obedient and did what he asked, and I wish I'd never done so. But there it was. And in the faculty, I mean, I ran through the tripos in a standard way. The person, however, whom I identified with in the faculty more than with any other was Edward Wellborn. Now, Edward Wellborn, who was then senior tutor of Emmanuel, he became master of Emmanuel. He had, as a pupil, been at Market Raisin Grammar School, and Charles Wilson also had been at Market Raisin Grammar School, and they had they were devoted allies of each other when in Cambridge. And Charles said, "You go to Edward Wellborn." He said, "There won't be many people there, but he said, you stick with it." And he said, "Be careful." He said, "Wellborn will come out with a string of impossible things, and at the end of the line, you'll say, 'I can't take this anymore.'" He said, "But at that point, be very careful." He said, "That's probably the only thing he's really thought about and can defend to the limit." And that was all duly transpired. And I went to Edward Wellborn lectures. That not a sentence was repeated all 3 years as an undergraduate. It's one of the smallest of the middle lane lecture rooms in the upper room, Tuesday and Thursday at 12 o'clock. And
what was he lecturing on?
Whatever came into his mind, really. It was called Some Technological Factors in English Economic History.
Left it wide open.
Yes. But he was a Johnsonian figure, and he wrote almost nothing. He wrote a little book, which in those days when you wrote in order to get your fellowship, and now you get a fellowship in order to write. And Edward Wellborn got a prize fellowship and wrote a little book on the Northumberland and Durham miners. And that's about the only thing he ever wrote. But he read voraciously and had an extraordinary memory. And there were no frontiers to his mind at all, and that was fascinating. He had a devoted band, a very small band of undergraduates and subsequently people, but he was written off as a clown by the history faculty. I learnt a great deal from him.
Were you lectured by John Saltmarsh?
Yes, indeed, and Christopher Morris. This was John Saltmarsh lectured on. Well, I have reason to know because in 1955, when I became an assistant lecturer in the faculty, I inherited the second half of John Saltmarsh's lecture course. The provenance of it was as follows. That Clapham, when he was professor, lectured on the whole of English economic history, from the beginning until the latest crisis of the pound. And that was 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday and Friday, lecture room 9 in Mill Lane, and the whole thing was covered. When he died, then, and I'm not sure whether he'd retired before he died, but anyway, when Clapham's course ended, but the course remained in the Tripos. It was taken over. No one could do the whole thing since then. It was taken over by John Saltmarsh during the first half and Charles Wilson during the second half. The break coming at devious points in the 17th century. Anyway, as soon as I was appointed, Charlie Wilson got out, and in the middle of August, when I was appointed. Charles Wilson said, "You're going to do that in the Michaelmas term," and I'd never worked so hard in my life to try and keep up. But anyway, I did the second half of that course, and I remember going to John Saltmarsh's rooms so that he could instruct me and where he stopped and where I had to begin. As I say, it wasn't a straight line; it was depended on what the topic was. And anyway, I knocked on the door, and this high-pitched voice said, "Come in," he said. And when I went in, he was sitting on the top of a very tall stepladder, and his dining room table had been completely extended, and the table was full of little bits of paper. I wondered what on earth I'd walked into. And he was vice provost, and he was planning the seating of a king's feast, and so trying to ensure that the appropriate people were sitting next to one another, or the inappropriate people were not sitting next to one another. And so I took over in that way in 1955. But anyway, my own. I went to the standard lecture. I went to Christopher Morris on the history of political thought in my second year.
Was Christopher a good lecturer or
yes,
moderate?
Indeed, he was a very how can I put it? He had a very specific style, and it was all he linked the topics of his political thought lectures with what was going on at the at the time, and he had a lot of things to say about politesse, I remember, and how he would change notices and put please in front of minatory instructions, that kind of thing. But no, I went to all his lectures. My second year this was.
Did you go to any of the famous John Saltmarsh lectures where he would lecture about the stirrup? Reputedly, he used to lecture on the stirrup and demonstrate its effects by charging down the lecture room with the board pointer, and occasionally nearly impaling one of the undergraduates.
I can't remember that, but I remember the content of the lectures very well. And I also went to a sort of rival course which Frank Salter was delivering, and that was again on English economic history, but I don't know whether they divided the field, but Saltmarsh was mainly on medieval, and I think that Salter carried through, but I don't know. I still may have some of those notes, but I can't remember at the minute.
What about someone you collaborated with later, Moni Poston?
Oh, I'm going to say yes. I went to Poston's lectures, clearly, and subsequently I had a great deal to do with Poston when I became a lecturer, or assistant lecturer. At the time, when I was an undergraduate, Charles Wilson had fallen out with Poston, whom he thought was a jumped-up refugee, which was not uncommon. That sort of thought. He was too clever by hand, too clever by half. Charlie Wilson thought of Poston, and Wilson tried to prevent me from actually going to Poston's lectures. So I did in fact go to Poston's lectures, but concealed the fact from Charles Wilson until he rumbled the fact, or I told him, and I said, I tried to defend Poston, and said, well, you must admit, Charles, that he does know about the manor. And Charles replied, he bloody well ought to, he was brought up on one, he said. But they subsequently became reconciled. But Jesus was, the historians in Jesus and Jesus in general were, it was an isolated college. It was away from the main line of Cambridge colleges. It existed in rural conservatism in its own grounds, and it was more inward looking, I think, than many other colleges, and it had its own very specific Anglican tradition. I mean, again, that was rural Anglicanism. I understood it perfectly well from Wingfield.
Did you go to the chapel?
I did indeed, yes. And although I think technically the chapel was not compulsory, it was assumed by most of the undergraduates that it was, and by the scholars and exhibitionists in particular that it was. And the Gardner Smith, who was the great Orthodox Dean of Chapel in Jesus, who was a highly conservative figure, of whom there's innumerable stories. But Gardner Smith, quite illegally, I believe, by 1948, he would get the head porter to stand behind a curtain in the chapel and prick off all the people who'd been there, so he would know who had gone, and more particularly who had not gone to chapel. And he was an arch conservative, one way or another. So, and I was in the choir at Jesus and so on.
How would you describe yourself now in your religious position?
Oh, again, I mean, a traditional Anglican, I would suppose. Yes, I am not as devout as my wife, who is much more committed to the church than I am. But oh well, I tag along, so to speak.
Okay, well, were there any of your undergraduate contemporaries who you kept in touch with since those days, or shall we move on to your, presume you went on and did a doctorate, or did you go straight into a lectureship? Or
I didn't do a doctorate.
No.
I was in that generation before it became either mandatory or indeed advantageous. It seemed at the time. I now wish I had done a doctorate. My absence of a doctorate is now concealed by the fact that I have a higher doctorate, so I could call myself doctor, but I never got a PhD. And having hooked a research fellowship at Jesus in the autumn of when I graduated in 1951. Was it 1952? I'm sorry. Charles Wilson said, "Well, my boy," he said, "now you've got your knees under a high table, you can resign from the register of graduate students," he says. And again, I obeyed him, and I wish I hadn't now. So,
what did you? So this is what year was it that you got your
I'm sorry?
research fellowship? What year was it?
1952.
And what were you going to research, even if you weren't going to do a?
Oh, I'd already been doing that for a year. I mean, I started. I knew what I was wanting to do at the time that I graduated in 1951. I was working on the brewing industry in the 18th century. Again, I mean, it was not recognised really as an appropriate academic subject in 1951. The reputation of the industry was totally polarised between those people who were probably from brewing families or connected with the industry directly, or those people who viewed it as the incarnation of the devil, one way or another. I mean, who were nonconformist and Methodist persuasions. And all this is now water under the bridge a very long time ago. But people would say, "Oh, what is your research?" And I say, "I'm working on the brewing industry in the 18th century." There would be either silence, a pregnant silence for a few seconds, or people would say, "Oh, how amusing." But the advantage was that there had been really no serious academic work on the industry at all, historically. That was doubly fortuitous and doubly fortunate because at that time almost all the brewing firms in the country, whether in London or Burton or elsewhere, were still run by the family or owned by the family, if not run by the family. And therefore family firms tend not to throw away their records. And I found 18th century records in every major brewery in London. And that made an enormous difference. And one of the possible advantages of not tailoring the research to the terms of a doctorate and a doctoral thesis here was that again Charles Wilson who said, "Well, now," he said, "you've got plenty of time." He said, write a big book, and I was able to get an assistant lectureship in the faculty in 1955, which gave me continuity of employment because my research fellowship had run out then in 55, and so I was not under any compulsion, any pressure to publish. So the research was eventually published, but as late as 1959 by the CUP, and that was. The book was too long for anyone to read and too expensive for anyone to buy at that time. But it stood me into good stead, I would say.
Your interest, I mean, this is a bit of a diversion, and we mentioned it before, but the fact that you were the leading historian of brewing and a drink to a large extent in England made you into the supervisor of one of the people who taught me, which was Brian Harrison.
Oh, yes. Yes, and I was very honoured because Brian Harrison came over from Oxford to be supervised.
You were still here. No.
Pardon?
You were still here, and And he came
yes,
over?
at that time, yes. I was here, my research fellowship ran out, as I said, in 1955, and that coincided with the resignation of the only historian in Queens, Alan Barker, and so Queens were desperate to as I say, this was in the summer of 1955, and Alan had simply thrown in his hand and returned to Eton, and as Beak, and Queens elected me, and I was flung in as the only historian in Queens to organise the whole of their teaching and do quite a lot of it myself. From the Michaelmas term, at the same time as I say, preparing all of Charlie Wilson's lectures that he'd run away from. So it was. I was not married then, and that made all the difference, in fact. But I was at Queen's from 1955 until 1968, and it was during that time that I think Brian Harrison.
What was he like as a student? He was an enormously hard-working, organised man, as I know.
Tremendously so. I mean, right from the start, he knew exactly what he wanted to do. He knew exactly how he was going to do it, and was only looking for a very occasional piece of advice from supervisor.
He had all those little cards, which I don't know if you ever saw his card index.
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. Yes.
Which greatly influenced me.
Yeah.
I borrowed all his undergraduate notes at Oxford and typed them all out once again, and then tried to internalise them to help me through my exams. But they were fantastic notes on all the books he'd read and lectures.
Yes, no, he was a fine scholar, and still is.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well. Which other historians, you must have known Donald Coleman well.
Yes, I did. I knew him when at LSE. It should be said that in 1951, after I graduated, and I had grown up completely within the Cambridge tradition, which was very parochial in many ways, as far as economic history was concerned, certainly. And I then joined T.S. Ashton's seminar in LSE and went down every week to the Institute of Historical Research, where he ran it. And I met Donald Coleman and all the LSE
Fisher. Fisher.
And Jack Fisher, yes. So who was very difficult to know what Jack Fisher believed in or didn't believe in. I mean, it was easier to work out what he didn't believe in, what he did believe in. He was very much a maverick in that way. But I knew, and T.S. Ashton was extremely kind to me, and I learned a great deal from TSA in that year, from 1951 to 1952 in the summer.
Was it?
And I knew Donald. Donald was he had calmed down a bit anyway by the time he came to Cambridge as professor, but he was a tiger when he was in LSE. He was quite unforgiving. He knew exactly what he believed in, and more particularly knew exactly what he didn't believe in, what he was hostile to, and was very much he was able to end a friendship more abruptly than many of the other people whom I have known. But but clearly he had a very powerful intellect, very powerful brain, and he ran an informal too institutionalized to call it a seminar, but we used to meet in his flat about twice a term in the Charing Cross Road where he had a flat in those days, and Donald would always cook the supper, and we would supply the wine, and which sometimes he felt was not as good as it ought to have been, and we would all hold forth, and that was very enlightening, more particularly coming from Cambridge into the big world of LSE and the London colleges. So I knew Donald quite well on those terms, so to speak, but I have never been a fellow member of a faculty with him.
Did you know R.H. Tawney? Did you ever meet him?
I did meet him. This was, wait a minute, in 1950. It should be said that when I came up, I had one friend in court in Cambridge, one friend at court in Cambridge, and that was Teddy Rich.
Oh yes.
E. Rich, who was then Master of St. Catherine's. By happen chance, Teddy Rich had been a pupil at Colston's, and his younger brother, whose initials I can't remember, was the gym master and the German master at Colston's until he was called up and went away for the war. But Teddy Rich, Ivor Rich it was, Ivor Rich had told Teddy that I had got a scholarship, and Teddy Rich welcomed me and invited me to tea when I got to Cambridge, and so I knew Teddy Rich, who really wasn't on the centre of the faculty in any way. But anyway, there was Teddy Rich, and in 1950, must have been 51, I think, possibly 50, Teddy Rich told me that I ought to, Teddy Rich was then treasurer, I think it was, or possibly secretary, I think treasurer, of the Economic History Society. And he told me that I ought to join the Economic History Society. Undergraduates then did not do so, but Teddy Rich said, well, the next conference, which was always held in the Easter vacation, is at Worcester. And I'm going there because we're going on in our caravan for a holiday, and you come with me and we'll go to the Economic History Society conference at Worcester. It was the second conference, I think, that the Society had held. So I did that, and to my surprise we started driving to Oxford, and I thought, this isn't the way to Worcester. But it was Worcester College.
I was going to ask you.
It crossed my mind that it was Worcester College, Oxford. I was an innocent abroad in those days, with very, very limited horizons of awareness, range of awareness and so on. Anyway, there I went to the conference there, and there was Tawney. And Tawney made an immense impression. He was very avuncular to me and was very kind to me. As president of the society, Tony took the chair.
Yes.
And on this occasion, Tony did not set himself on fire, but someone sitting in one of the front rows was lighting a pipe, and a little bit of spark went into the matchbox, and there was a little flutter, and an acrid smell drifted out. Tony always went to sleep when he put his glasses on top of Great Dome's head and closed his eyes. When the puff of smoke reached Tony, he slowly awoke, put his glasses slowly onto his nose, put out a fatherly figure, fatherly hand to the person who was reading the lecture to stop him, and said in an avuncular voice, "Is someone burning prematurely?" And it was a masterstroke, as you can imagine.
Do you think he really went to sleep, or was he just...
Oh, I don't think so, no. I think it was...
relaxing.
Yeah.
How old was he?
Sorry?
About how old was he at this point in?
Oh, as far as I was concerned then, because I was only, whatever it was,
22.
I was 23, yes. He was an infant at age.
Did you know Eileen Power at all?
Never.
No.
Never. I mean, she died 1940, was it not?
Yes, it was early.
That was before I became aware of all these things. Although I heard quite a lot about her, of course, from Boston and from Cynthia. Because I got to know Boston quite well immediately after, in 1955, when everything happened to me in 1955 except marriage. That was postponed for 3 years. I mean, not because I knew the person I was going to marry then, but as I say, everything happened in 1955, including the fact that I became assistant editor of the Economic History Review at that time, of which Boston was then the editor. So we had I had quite a lot to do with him then, and also in the 50s he was in the process of initiating the International Economic History Society with Brodell, and I became this was before the International Association was actually set up, but I was sort of informal secretary of the association, and Kenneth Beryl, who was then in 55, Kenneth Beryl was then first person here, and Kenneth Beryl became the treasurer of the incipient society, as I became its secretary, and both of us were essentially dancing at the feet of Boston and trying to pick up all the ends which Boston was scattering in his way. But so.
Did you stay? Did you go to Oxford for a while, or did you stay here for the whole of your career?
No. I was. I was here. Save only that I spent the academic year 1952 to 3 in the United States, in Harvard and in MIT, and that was Charles Wilson again said, "Look, my boy," he said, "you better learn some economics," and that had not been possible within the history tripos here, significantly anyway, and so I had a fellowship. It was to be from 1951 to 52, immediately after I graduated, but Charles Wilson forgot to send the application in, so I had to reapply, but then he did send it in, because I pushed him to. I was then on the alert to make sure he did, and I went to the United States from 1952 to 53. But that was the only time that I'd left Cambridge before 1968, when I was appointed in Oxford, and was in Oxford 20 years.
Tell me about the Oxford time. I mean,
The Oxford?
the period in Oxford. Were there particular people there who you became close to and influenced your work?
Habakkuk was. I succeeded Habakkuk.
All right.
Habakkuk had been appointed Master of Jesus in Oxford, and in Oxford you couldn't at the same time hold a chair and be head of house, so he resigned, he resigned from the chair, and I applied for the chair. And I applied for the chair because David Jocelyn had succeeded Poston here when Poston retired, and David Jocelyn was 2 years older than I was, and that meant that the Cambridge chair was, in anticipation, was blocked until I was reached the age of 65, and that seemed to me an inordinate time ahead. And I hadn't thought about applying applying for a chair elsewhere. Look at it rain. Look at that rain. When Habakkuk vacated the chair in Oxford, I was induced to apply at that time, and so I did so. And then, you know, as the ironies of this life turned out, within a year and a bit, David Jocelyn had a heart attack and died on his way in October 1969, I think it was, coming back from his first lecture in Mill Lane, and I had gone to Oxford in '68 and took up the chair for 1st of January '69, I think it was. Anyway, then a lot of people in Cambridge, because all our friends were in Cambridge, the children, all their friends were in Cambridge, all my colleagues were in Cambridge, and a lot of people in Cambridge said, "You must apply for the chair in Cambridge. Come back." And at first it was an attractive supposition of thought. But then when you thought about it, the more you thought about it, the more impossible it was. But anyway, because I'd just taken up the chair in Oxford, children were at school, we bought a house, and so on. But then in the end, a group of people in Cambridge sent Poston to Oxford to try and persuade me to apply for the chair here, because it was vacant following David Jocelyn's death. And I said, look, well, yeah, it's all very nice, but and flattering, but you think if I applied for the chair and didn't get it, then I would be a rat that failed to jump off the ship in Oxford. I could never look anyone in the face in Oxford again. He said, "My dear Peter," he said, "to be no need to," he said. A very Poston remark. I stayed in Oxford and would have done anyway, I think, for 20 years.
Which college were you attached to?
All Souls.
All Souls.
All Souls funded the chair in 1931. And they offered it to Tony. Tony would have been the first holder of the chair in Oxford, but he declined to leave London. Was
W.G. Hoskins still at All Souls at that time?
Yes, he was, but he never appeared. I mean, he showed a profound reluctance to leave Devonshire, to leave Exeter. So I seldom saw him.
You saw Joan Thirsk, I expect?
Yes, of course, of course. and but Habakkuk was the person who was most prominent on my horizon, so to speak.
Tell me, it's a big, tall order at the end of an interview, but it would be very nice if you gave, I know a lot of your work has been to do with the Industrial Revolution, and you've written a number of books around that theme. If you had to sort of give a short resume of what you thought were your major contributions in history, would they be to the theory of the Industrial Revolution, or would they be in developing from your work on the brewing industry, or?
They would be, I think, centred on the more general issues of industrialisation. I mean, almost all my work has been based upon primary sources which were British in commitment, but it would be the process of industrialisation more generally, and in a comparative sense from the European context as well, and also in business history. I mean, I wrote a history of all the multiple retailing companies which came together when Unilever was formed in 1931, and each of the production companies had acquired a trail of dependent and wholly owned, usually, retailing companies, because the linchpin of the business was margarine, which had induced very large-scale organizations in production, and margarine was a perishable commodity, and therefore to ensure quality as well as to capture downstream profits, they've all integrated forwards to control their own retailing outlets. And when Unilever was formed, which was essentially an amalgamation of the production companies, there was this trail of retailers which each of the main constituent production companies had brought in their wake, and they were then amalgamated and grouped under a holding company called Allied Suppliers. Charles Wilson was then finishing his work on Unilever. I mean, he wrote a very influential business history. It was the first academic business history of its kind, anyway. In not so much for banking, but certainly for industry. And I had then finished brewing, which had not been published, but it was in process of being published. And Charles persuaded me to write the history of the retailing companies which were formed within under the umbrella of Unilever, which I did, and that was published by Longmans in 1967, which what was his name? Christopher Blagden in Longmans wanted to call it counter-revolution. He wanted to call it, but he was only persuaded by his marketing people that would throw a lot of people off the trail, as it was economic history.
Especially in 1967.
That was published in '67,
yeah. And
that gave me an entree to business history, and I've been interested in business history since then. But to come back to your question, it would be the general issue of the comparative processes of industrialization, more particularly in the European context. So.
Well, following that up, I notice you lecture and visit Italy quite frequently. Is that part of this project of comparison?
No, not really. I had from the late 50s, when the International Association was formed, it was formed in, constitutionally anyway, in '62. I began to have a international interest or international horizon, put it that way, and I became the British representative on the junta, which never was a committee more aptly named as a junta in the English sense, at the International Institute in Prato, which was then getting into its stride, and therefore I had this annual commitment in Prato, and met a lot of the Italian economic historians through there. And one of them, called Luigi de Rosa, who was the uncrowned king in economic history of Naples, and ran. He was a very powerful man in Italy, academically, I mean, and through Luigi, I acquired various commitments in Italy. One of which has been I've been looking after, in various dimensions of looking after, the Journal of European Economic History, which Luigi founded in 1971, I think it was, and I've been involved in that a great deal ever since then. And I read the proofs, and I'm not technically a member of the editorial board, but nothing much happens which I don't know about in that respect. And that has been published by the Bank of Rome, and I'm still very much involved in that. But also Luigi was a determinant economic historian in the International Institute in Naples, the Institute of Philosophical Studies in Naples. And for the last 10 years, I think it is now, I have been given a course of lectures every year at the Institute in Naples. Luigi died 3 years ago now, but his commitments have lived on after him, and they have wanted me to continue. This is a separate commitment every year, and they have a general theme of the Institute, and I try and fit in with what the Institute is doing in that particular year. But they've published two little books of the lectures, and there's two more in the press in Naples, and that has been an attractive commitment for me, and also I owed a great deal to Luigi, and I've been glad to help to keep his commitments going, so to speak, whether it's the Journal of European Economic History or other associated commitments of the Bank of Rome, which, as with other Italian banks, is metamorphosed. It was bought out and became Capitalia. It's now Unicredit, as a much bigger amalgamated grouping of Italian banks, but it's, and curiously, they've just gone back to the original name of the Banca di Roma. So that is another international commitment that I keep going.
Can I ask you about one further? Well, I don't know if it's a commitment, but I noticed I think you have an honorary degree and you visit Japan. You have an interest in Japan.
Yes, again, I should. I mean, it's a source of not embarrassment exactly, but it's something that needs explaining. Put it that way. I have never done any work, any research using Japanese data, nor, for that matter, have I done any work using primary Italian data. But as far as Japan is concerned, I picked up the standard international commitments of links with Japan, with international meetings, and I had one or two, or three or four Japanese scholars who were sent by their professors in Japan to take doctorates in Oxford, and therefore became known to Japanese economic historians in Japan, and that link continues. But also there were two other constituents of that nexus with Japan. One of them, dating from 1952, was when the present Crown Prince, he wasn't Crown Prince then, but when the present Crown Prince, Naruhito, came to Oxford, I became his research supervisor. And that was, I mean, he had bucked the trend of his family, because all his family, his father and grandfather and his younger brother and every cousin, I should think, too, were marine biologists.
That's right.
But Hiro, right from his undergraduate days at Gatchwin University, was an economic historian. And when his family and also the Japanese government and the Imperial Household Agency wanted him as a future emperor to spend 2 years in the West, either in the United States or Harvard. Oxford was chosen, or Britain was chosen, and I had been much involved with one of his senior academic advisors in Japan, and so I mean, how the choice was made, I don't know, but anyway, he came to Oxford, and that was from 1952 to 1960. What am I talking about?
72. Well, you went to Oxford in 68, was that right?
He came to Oxford in 1982.
82, yes.
And for 2 years. And as I say, I became his research supervisor, and that commitment has continued to a degree. And in fact, I should see him again in November this year. That was one link which consolidated my nexus with Japan, and that meant very much more than I had realized it would at the time in 1982, and it means much more in Japan, I think it does in than it does in the UK, certainly. But that is one thing, and the other thing is that when I came to Downing in 1987, I found that there was a link with Kale, and that has consolidated.
There's a portrait of Fukuzawa, I noticed.
Yes, that's right.
I wrote half a book on Fukuzawa once.
Oh, yes, well, that's very much there. And also there was a 10,000 yen note, which was
I've got one up there.
by the portrait.
I'll show you later. I was given it by a leading Japanese economic historian. I'll tell you the story of Hayami Akira.
Oh yes, I know him very well. Akira.
Yes, I've got his wallet up there with a 10,000 yen note in it.
How extraordinary. Well, the £10,000 note which was framed underneath the portrait, that was stolen in Downing.
Well, many links, but I think we're drawing to the time when I should let you go. Is there anything particular that you would have liked me to have asked you about? And
I mean, we've only just scratched the surface.
I know.
I mean, and also, I've only, I don't know, I scarcely reached Oxford. I mean, and there was a great deal more to be said about Cambridge, clearly. But there we are.
There we are. That's how it is. But anyway, thank you very much indeed.
Good.